Good afternoon. My name is Alex Padilla. I'm the director of the Exploring Economic Freedom program. The goal of this program, which was founded in 2007, is to provide students and the broader community with an academic forum to discuss and debate the role of economic freedom plays in improving people's welfare. We invite distinguished scholars. In doing so, MSU Denver provides the opportunity to learn about the role that economic and political freedom plays in promoting entrepreneurship, economic growth, prosperity, and peace. Today, we are very lucky to have a distinguished panel of scholars that are going to talk about the new book by Christopher Coyne and Abigail Hall entitled Tyranny Comes Home, The Domestic Fate of U.S. Domestic Militarism. In this book, the authors discuss how foreign government interventions are affecting domestic politics and increasing the extent to which we live in a police state. I would like now to introduce you to our moderator, which is Tamara Banks. Tamara Banks is an Emmy Award-winning freelance journalist who has reported on many international human rights topics, including a documentary short film, The Long Journey Home, depicting the journey home of former Sudanese slaves. Please welcome Ms. Tamara Banks. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Padilla. Such an honor and a pleasure to be with you on this beautiful Colorado Spring afternoon. This discussion of the militarization of domestic policing is especially important and relevant today, isn't it? Many Americans, we believe that foreign military intervention is important to protecting our domestic freedoms, right? But that's not always the case. As we get into the subject with our expert panelists, you'll quickly see why. The authors of Tyranny Comes Home, The Domestic Fate of U.S. Militarism, examine what they call the boomerang effect. They take a look at a variety of cases that include the rise of surveillance, the militarization of domestic law enforcement, the expanding use of drones, and torture in U.S. prisons. I couldn't put this book down. It was just amazing. It gives us an alarming insight into the incidents like the fatal police shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and the Snowden case. So I'm honored again to introduce our panelists this afternoon. To my direct right, co-author of Tyranny Comes Home, The Domestic Fate of U.S. Militarism, Christopher Coyne is an associate professor of economics at George Mason University and the associate director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center. Other books he's authored include Doing Bad by Doing Good, Why Humanitarian Action Fails, I gotta read that one, and War After, The Political Economy of Exporting Democracy. That's just to name a couple of them. In addition, Dr. Coyne has authored numerous academic articles, book chapters, and policy studies. And in 2016, he received George Mason's University Teaching Excellence Award. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Chris Coyne. Also on the panel, the other co-author of Tyranny Comes Home, The Domestic Fate of U.S. Militarism, Abigail R. Hall. Abigail R. Hall is an assistant professor in economics at the University of Tampa in Tampa, Florida. She's a research fellow with the Independent Institute, a nonpartisan research and educational think tank based in Oakland, California. Dr. Hall is also an affiliated scholar with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and an affiliated scholar with the Foundation for Economic Education. She earned her PhD in economics from George Mason, a BA in economics and business administration with an additional concentration in mathematics at Bellarmine University in Louisville, Kentucky. Professor Hall is also interested in Austrian economics, political economy and public choice, defense and peace economics, and institutions and economic development. She's currently researching how foreign intervention adversely impact domestic, political, social, and other institutions. Please welcome Dr. Abigail Hall. Our third panelist this afternoon is Dr. Amy Eckert. Amy Eckert is an associate professor of political science right here at Metropolitan State University of Denver. Her interest in teaching and research focus on international relations, particularly international ethics and international law, including the just war tradition. She is the author of Outsourcing War, the Just War Tradition in the Age of Military Privatization. And her work has appeared in journals including International Studies Quarterly and the Journal of International Political Theory. She co-edits with Stephen C. Roach a series entitled Ethics and the Challenges of Contemporary War, published by SUNY Press. She is currently section leader of the International Studies Association's International Ethics section. Professor Eckert holds a BA from the University of Notre Dame, JD from University of Denver's Sturm College of Law, and PhD from the University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. Please let's welcome Dr. Eckert and all of our panelists. So I kind of want to jump right away with our authors, and the two of you talk about Mark Twain's ominous warning. Of course, Mark Twain, the famous author. He was also a political commentator and humorist. Talk about Twain's warning and why it matters today.
So when we chose the quote by Mark Twain, he's referencing what he refers to as a hypothetical great republic. And this republic has engaged in a variety of foreign interventions. And what has ultimately happened is that the processes that this government or this republic has developed abroad wind up being used back home. Now, Twain was talking about conflicts in his lifetime where he was writing. He was actually, it's a satirical piece on the U.S. occupation of the Philippines. And so we use that quote throughout the book as a way to frame what it is that we're talking about. So he said, what if Twain's quote, what if this idea of a great republic is not hypothetical? What if this is actually reality? And so what we set out to do in the book is to explain exactly what it is that Twain is talking about, how it is that foreign intervention actually has very real domestic consequences. One thing that we realize and that we see in academic literature, in public discourse, and elsewhere, is that people tend to try to separate cleanly foreign intervention or foreign policy from domestic policy. And what we're attempting to do here, among other things, is to hopefully shine a light on the fact that you can't make that clear distinction, that the two areas can and do relate to each other.
Chris, you want to follow up on that, add a little bit more?
Sure. Well, just to add a little more context, Mark Twain, of course, most people learn about him and know about him as the great American novelist, which of course he was. What they know much less about is that Twain was a staunch anti-imperialist. He was the prominent member of what was called the Anti-Imperialist League. Of course, as Abby mentioned, the time frame here is the U.S. annexation of the Philippines. So we're talking late 1890s into the early 1900s. And what worried Twain about this was that what he viewed as the fundamental core values of America, true individualism, self-responsibility, liberty, freedom, respect for other people, those values were going to be lost if America engaged in a proactive militaristic foreign policy abroad. And he was worried that those issues would then come back and undermine domestic life. And so that's really what the book is all about, is exploring kind of in the modern day various ways that this takes place. And we argue that it's a very relevant insight that's overlooked by both policymakers as well as by many citizens.
One of the things that struck me about this book is some of the examples that you use, including, as I mentioned earlier, the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson. And many of you will probably remember the number of tanks and camouflage and night vision that was used. And I wonder if that's kind of a good example of the boomerang effect that you talk about.
So absolutely, one of the chapters that we discuss is broadly the militarization of U.S. domestic police. And so we talk about a variety of different issues, so Michael Brown included, but just much more broadly, how it is that you see foreign intervention directly relating to militarized police. Historically, the police and the military have served two very different functions. So police are intended to be peacekeepers. They are to protect and serve their civilian population, both those people who are criminal offenders and people who are innocent victims. The military, by contrast, is meant to go and engage in combat abroad to physically destroy enemy combatants. And so what we identify in this book, and one thing that we found out was that Twain's quote related to the Philippines wound up being very relevant, because one of the earliest places we start to see the groundwork being laid for this militarization is actually in veterans coming back from this conflict in the Philippines. So we look at that. We also look at the formation of SWAT teams in the United States, which, especially after the Michael Brown protest, became very relevant. People started asking questions like, why are there tanks? Why are police officers dressed in what appear to be military uniforms? So we link that back to Vietnam, and then we bring that forward to continue talking about some trends in modern policing, particularly as they relate to the war on terror and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
One of the examples that we can think of here in Denver is in June of 2015 in Greenwood Village, the SWAT team with their police force used a tank to pursue a suspected shoplifter and, for all intents and purposes, destroyed a home. So you kind of start to think about, well, what is the balance between pursuing a shoplifter and with traditional police enforcement and then military extremes? Let me, I'm going to get to you and Director Eckert in just one moment. Let me ask you one more question, our authors. You argue that economists often ignore changes in scope of government and tend to focus on scale. Can you explain the difference and discuss why this is the case?
Sure. So there's this important distinction between scale and scope. Scale is the size of something. And so, if you read the newspaper or hear politicians talk or read economists, whether it's academic or in popular writings, they'll tend to focus on scale. Scale is something like this. What is the budget of a government? What are the number of people employed in a government? How many regulations were passed by a government in a period of time? These are all measuring certain aspects of the size. And that's important, but it misses a fundamental component of understanding how government affects our life, which is the scope or the range of activities that is undertaken by government. So think about it like this. Following the 9/11 attacks, and with the onset of what today we refer to as the war on terror, the surveillance apparatus of the US government, which was already in place for decades, but it expanded enormously. Because of technological innovations, it's not like the defense budget had to grow dramatically in order for the scope of government influence over your and my lives in America to grow. That is, the scale could remain relatively constant or increase slightly, but the scope or range of activities could increase dramatically and did increase dramatically. The reason this is neglected by economists is that it's hard to measure. There's no simple aggregate to capture the scope of government activities like there is a simple measure of scale. And so one of the things we introduce early on is this distinction, and we urge our fellow economists and social scientists more broadly, as well as fellow citizens, to think about these things. Not simply to think about the number of rules or the size of a budget being spent, which again is important, but misses the range of activities and how it influences our lives on a daily basis.
Thank you. And Dr. Eckert, I'll ask you sort of a follow-up question to that in terms of, with regard to growth in government, scope poses obvious problems we just discussed, but talk about scale being an issue as well.
Thanks, Tamara. And I would just like to say I really enjoyed this book as well. I was saying to Tamara before we began that the topics that you talk about in this book are obviously significant sources of preoccupation in my discipline and for me personally. So it was very interesting for me to kind of read a book on these topics written by economists, and I just for purposes of qualification, I'm certainly not an economist. This will become probably quite apparent. But yeah, no, I think it's an interesting distinction between scope and scale. And certainly we've seen, we've seen a fairly steady increase in certainly the scale of government. Definitely even, reaching back into the 20th century, I would pinpoint kind of the beginning of the growth and scale with kind of the emergence of the modern presidency around the time of the Great Depression, when we began kind of looking to government on a social level to do more than it had done previously. And we kind of saw, the beginnings of that kind of in that origin. And in essence, it's grown quite steadily ever since, right? Even when we've had fairly conservative small state presidents in office, it's continued just to grow in terms of scale. But I think I would share the author's contention that it's really the scope that in many ways is more problematic, at least from my point of view. If we're seeing government reaching into especially areas of civil rights and liberties that it hasn't been reaching into previously, or we see it assuming a more extensive role in terms of surveillance or claiming the authority to detain people, perhaps indefinitely, then I feel like that's definitely the more problematic dimension in terms of growth.
So let me ask you all three this question about, are there circumstances in which the government could expand scale, but then not engage in repressive practices associated with social control?
I think there's at least theoretically the potential for that. The authors talk about it at several points in the book, the government paradox, where if we have a government that is strong enough to provide us with security from external threats, then it also has the capability to turn that power inward and infringe upon individual rights and freedoms with that same capability. And I mean, certainly where we see the boomerang effect happening, that's exactly what's happening. But I don't know that that's inevitable. I mean, it feels so skeptical to say that it's inevitable that any time we have a government that's kind of large in scale or capable enough to protect us, that it's invariably going to infringe on our own individual rights and freedoms. And I mean, I think if we look around at other states in the world, we don't see it necessarily happening to the same degree, which I think is also suggestive that this is not an inevitability as much as it might be happening in this particular case. So I think it's at least possible that we could have a government that grows in terms of its size and its scale, but doesn't necessarily kind of also grow in terms of scope and begin infringing in things that we think of as kind of the private sphere, or our private lives, or our individual rights.
And authors ask you the same.
Sure, so we definitely would agree with that. So Chris mentioned earlier that one of the reasons economists tend to neglect scope is because it's difficult to measure. One of the other reasons that they neglect it is because they typically assume that it's correlated with scale. So they assume that if the scale of government is growing, the scope of government must also be growing. But we point out that they may be correlated, but they also may not be correlated. So you could imagine exactly the scenario that you laid out, where you have a government that's large in scale, but the scope or its portfolio of activities is relatively small. On the other hand, you could have a government that's very small in scale, but it's a totalitarian regime, and it's has a very expansive scope. So I think we'd agree with that characterization, that it's not. You could certainly envision a scenario where you have a government growing in scale, but not necessarily scope.
So kind of jumping back to the boomerang effect, we touched a little bit around the issue of using tanks and camouflage. Are there some other examples that you can talk about the boomerang effect and explain how it's showing up with militarization of the domestic police?
Sure. Let me just say a quick word about what the boomerang effect is. And so The idea behind this is as follows. Start by thinking about what coercive foreign intervention entails. Again, many people think of the military, the U.S. military and foreign policy as protecting Americans. Of course, they'll say this is one of the fundamental roles that government plays. But at its core, a proactive foreign intervention, which I would argue is what drives American foreign policy for the past several decades, is really viewing the military as the primary solution to many of the supposed ills of the world. So what does that entail? It entails a small group of people, the political elite, sitting in Washington, D.C., identifying problems, perceived problems in other societies, and then using the threat of force or actual force to coerce people in other societies to bring about some end desired by the political elite. Think about what that entails, what kind of mindset that entails. It entails the idea that the elite know what's best for the world, that they can bring about that end by imposing it upon other human beings, backed by force. And so the idea of the boomerang effect is that a foreign intervention, both the preparation for intervention and intervention itself, is fundamentally one of force. And under certain conditions, that ends up boomeranging or coming back to domestic life. And so this issue of kind of militarization of police with the tanks and so on and military equipment is one example of this, but there's many others. The surveillance state, which of course is a term that gets thrown around a lot, and again, I think the context is lost. The U.S. national security state is the most powerful surveillance apparatus in the history of mankind. And that's bipartisan, meaning it's across presidential or presidents. And so it's not a Democrat or a Republican issue. That can be traced back again to the occupation of the Philippines. Many of the original kind of technologies and techniques that were used to control citizens in the Philippines were brought back to the United States, and the surveillance apparatus was set up here. Drones. Drones were originally developed as means of target practice for the military. Over time, they expanded as technology increased. They were used for surveillance. And it's really in the post 9/11 period that you see them being used to annihilate targets. That is as an offensive weapon. Drones have come back to be used domestically, mainly by the Border Patrol, but also by the FBI as well, for surveillance purposes. And so there's numerous instances where you see these technologies and methods of social control developed abroad coming back to affect our lives. And as these technologies advance, and kind of the scary aspect of this is that it's very covert. You and I don't know that we're being surveilled until a whistleblower reveals it. You and I don't know the role of drones in domestic life because their very purpose is to covertly surveil people. And so that's the dilemma for us as citizens, is how do we monitor and constrain government so that it does beneficial things to the extent it does beneficial things and prevent it from doing harm to our liberties.
One of the things that strikes me in your last two recent statements and the book throughout is that it seems as though the government can capitalize on the fear. So we have 9/11, and now suddenly we have another layer of government called Homeland Security. Am I reading that right? Is that how the government gets the buy-in to get away with some of these things? The government knows best.
So it's one of the factors that we discuss is fear being a powerful motivator. And so we're not the first people to talk about this. Our work builds very much on the work of an economist named Robert Higgs. He's an economic historian. And he talks about fear as a way that government has kind of an inroad to expand in terms of scale and scope. So you think about the onset of a crisis, whether that crisis is real or if that crisis is perceived, it doesn't matter. But you think about what happens when there is something like a terror attack or a natural disaster, or perhaps everyone at 3 a.m. this morning wakes up and thinks that there is a monster under their bed. It doesn't really matter. But the reaction is often for people to want government to do something to alleviate this, again, real or perceived threat. And government, as it tends to do, will do something to try to, or at least to give the appearance that they have the means and the ability to mitigate this threat. And so I think an example is particularly helpful. Now, a lot of people in this room are probably too young to remember flying before 9/11, But if you ask your parents, or if you are old enough that you remember flying before 9/11, then the idea that your person and your property would be subject to potentially multiple searches, including a physical search of your person in particularly intimate areas by some random person in blue gloves, would have been absolutely unfathomable. However, after 9/11, after someone trying to light their shoes on fire on an airplane, people have this concern about terrorism when they fly. And so now these things, which were once considered to be just complete gross violations against people's right to privacy and liberties, are now considered standard operating procedure and acceptable as a result of the fact that people are afraid.
So, Dr. Eckert, in light of the boomerang effect, is that line between domestic and international politics sort of non-existent or a little blurred?
I honestly think it's been eroding for a long time. That we kind of envision this very sharp wall between what happens in the international system, which we tend to think of as kind of a more dangerous area than domestic politics. And domestic politics, we like to have at least the belief that it's kind of a sphere of order and safety and peace. But I mean, I think realistically, we've seen the line between those two eroding for some time, even well before kind of the 9/11 attacks that you mentioned, and kind of the rise of the global war on terror and its kind of successor policies. I definitely think that this has been a step that definitely exacerbated that and probably really accelerated the erosion of that division between the domestic and the international. One of the kind of interesting details out of the book is just the notation that, to some extent we have a long history of some of these practices like surveillance or otherwise kind of eroding individuals' rights, but they tended to be directed at very discrete types of populations, right? People who were foreigners or people who were involved with organized labor, anarchists, right? Different categories of people who were to some extent pretty easily identified and kind of marginalized. But if we think about the dynamics of the global war on terror, or even the war on drugs, which you talk about also in the book, it's not as easy to discern who's potentially a threat if we're thinking about those populations, right? It's not necessarily immediately obvious who's a drug dealer if we're thinking about the war on drugs, or who might be working with a foreign agent or a foreign government, or with an organization like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. So it kind of further erodes that boundary, because if we accept that these kind of internationalized elements are threats, they're threats that aren't. It's not readily apparent kind of where the boundary around them is, and so to the extent that they have the capacity to blend in, then it creates at least the basis to kind of expand these oppressive practices. And as a result, we kind of all have to take our shoes off at the airport and go through this extensive and very intrusive set of process of screening. Yeah.
So then, Dr. Eckert, to sort of follow up on that, the human dimension of intervention as foreign policy is essential to the pursuit of intervention abroad. What gives people involved this strong belief, this strong faith that usage of intervention and force really is the way to address law enforcement?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, to kind of pick up on one of the previous comments and kind of a thread out of the book, people have faith in military intervention to fulfill a lot of different purposes, whether it's security and kind of keeping us safe and dealing with things that are dangerous, or kind of conversely, whether it's meant to be something that's done to help in some way in the context of a humanitarian crisis or human rights violations. We see a lot of different strands of I guess foreign policy hawkishness, right? We have a number of people who are foreign policy hawks, who can advocate the use of military force to deal with security threats or things that are deemed to be in the national interest. But kind of on the flip side, we also see people who are liberal institutionalists who are enthusiastic about engaging in the use of force for what we might deem as more humanitarian or even sympathetic purposes. But in the end, they kind of both get to the same place of having that faith in the use of military force.
So let me get back to the authors here. There's going to be a police officer, a sheriff's deputy, a SWAT officer who may read your book or hear about it and say, you know what, we need this kind of intelligence, this surveillance. We need the tanks to get after these bad hombres, if you will, to pursue the criminals and to keep not only ourselves but the public safe. How do you address somebody who has that sort of opinion?
Well, there's a couple related aspects to this. One thing that I do want to make clear, and it's oftentimes misunderstood, not just in the context of our book, but when you talk about these topics in general, a lot of people view a discussion of, for instance, the militarization of police or issues of surveillance as somehow being anti-police or anti-military. And I don't think that is necessarily the case. I think talking about as citizens that live in a society where there are police, where there are military, and where those entities possess force, a monopoly over force, that you can have these conversations without being pro or anti, just having a realistic, rational discussion of these things and kind of the costs and benefits in broad terms. That said, of course there are benefits to having a large surveillance state. Of course there are benefits to having tanks and other military equipment. The question is, at what cost? And what are we as citizens willing to trade off? If the concern, for instance, is one of protecting police domestically, I think there are much easier ways to do that, if that is genuinely the goal. One potential avenue to explore is rolling back, if not completely undoing, the war on drugs. Typically, the argument, for instance, for the need for military equipment is that, well, look, drug cartels, gangs have this high-powered weaponry that puts police in harm's way. Well, then, of course, one response is, well, let's give the police military equipment. Another potential avenue to explore is, well, why do the gangs have that equipment, that high-powered weaponry? And, of course, the reason they have it is because drugs have been prohibited by law, by government. And, of course, we have historical episodes of this, something called Prohibition. Under Prohibition, of course, we saw the rise of gangs with high-powered weapons. Absent Prohibition, we see peaceful transactions taking place between people who want to purchase alcohol and people that sell it. And we also see, of course, peaceful, legal drug dealers. They're called your local pharmacist. In this area, there's no concern of violence. It's only when things are prohibited by government. And so if people are truly committed to protecting police, it seems like there's much easier ways than ramping up some kind of arms race between police and gangs, because, of course, there's spillover effects. There's spillover effects of militarizing society that oftentimes fall on innocent people and the disenfranchised, the people that are most vulnerable to these things. And so to our way of thinking, there are much lower cost ways of overcoming these issues, fully appreciating that the goal is to both make the lives of citizens better off, but also to make the lives of police better off as well.
Abby, did you want to add anything to want to pitch?
No, I think it's accurate. I think another point maybe to add on to that is that, because I think Chris and I both, and certainly other people who talk about police militarization as well, get that question a lot, both in terms of the being anti-police, anti-military, but also this question about needing particular weapons or particular types of equipment. And I think, and again, just to be pragmatic about it, I think you can make a very different case for maybe a city like New York versus a town like Keene, New Hampshire. Why do I bring up this random northeastern town? Because it has about 20,000 people. I believe they haven't had a murder since something like 1999, and yet they have a Bearcat, which is an armored vehicle. which is a mine-resistant armored car. You have these towns throughout the United States which have SWAT teams. And instead of being used for things like going after, dangerous cartels or people who might be engaging in terrorist activities, they're doing things like being deployed when people are threatening to commit suicide. I think it's a much more difficult argument to make in a lot of cases that those kinds of equipment are necessary.
I think it was just last year I was at Manual High School one Saturday morning for some reason, and there was a tank parked in front of the school, and I don't know, maybe it was a show and tell, but to me there's also sort of a message that's sent there to a predominantly black school in a black neighborhood, but maybe that's just me. There's a ton of money spent on the equipment. The U.S. government has given local police departments more than 600 MRAPs, and those are those big tanks that are almost virtually bomb-proof. Texas has 68 of them, and Florida has about 45 of them. So I guess my question to all the panelists is there an end in sight for this kind of beefing up of domestic law enforcement with this kind of money and this kind of artillery when there's so much money involved?
There's no end in sight to our reading and understanding of the situation. And this is kind of where we come down in some of the implications at the end of the book. There's no end in sight under the current arrangement, which is one where the federal government transfers this property, this military property, to a variety of locales, and the locales enjoy receiving it for a variety of reasons. That is, unless the citizenry puts up a concerted effort, takes the costs or potential costs of this type of behavior seriously and determines that they find it unacceptable. And one of the main kind of takeaways from the book is that there's a burden, and this is beyond the topics in the book, but in a free society there's a very heavy burden on citizens. And by free society I mean a liberal democratic society. Citizens have to care. Citizens, and caring can be a matter of just pure indifference. Like, you'll hear people say, I have nothing to hide. Police or the government, they can surveil what I do. That's okay, because I'm not one of the bad people. That's, to our way of thinking, a very dangerous way of thinking, because it grants government a pass. And so really that's the only way out of it. Government's not going to constrain itself. President Obama, at the end of his last term, put in place some minor restrictions on the militarization of police, but the Trump administration just quickly removed those when they got into office. And so looking to government to prevent this flow of weaponry from happening is, to our way of thinking, not a very effective solution to the problem.
Dr. Eckert, let me ask you, international relations, there is sometimes talk about securitization, which is the process of state actors transforming subjects into matters of security. Talk a little bit about how that plays into the boomerang effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Securitization is kind of a process by which something that is not necessarily a security issue comes to be framed as a security issue, which of course is then suggestive not only that it enjoys a special priority, but it also suggests a certain type of response to the problem. And we've seen that happening kind of within the international system on a number of issues. For example, piracy, right? It's not obvious that piracy is necessarily a security issue. We could very easily view it alternatively as an economic issue, that there's a lack of economic opportunity, and so people turn to this practice that essentially involves holding ships and crews hostage until insurance companies pay up, and then they kind of move on. It's not obvious that this is a security threat, yet we've on some level come to see it that way. And so we've at times responded with various military responses. We've sent military contractors off to kind of fight the pirates, and it's not clear that this is a strategy that's very productive or effective in dealing with the problem. And we've seen this dynamic of securitization happening with a number of different types of issues, including things like immigration or health or things that again aren't obviously security threats. And I think this really does fit into what the authors are talking about in this book in terms of the security threat, because we're framing a number of things as kind of security issues or things that require this type of forcible response. It's certainly obvious in the discussion about militarization of the police, where we come to see things that aren't obviously threatening, that aren't obviously posing a danger to society as a whole. Like your example, Tamara, of kind of dispatching the SWAT team if someone is suicidal or if it's a domestic violence situation, which, not to condone that, but it's certainly not the type of broad social threat that calls for the SWAT team as a response. And I think the more that we're, as a society, willing to accept the proposition that certain things are security threats, it kind of primes us to accept a certain type of response to it, where we're kind of willing to accept that responding with tanks or with this kind of overkill in terms of equipment or personnel is kind of an appropriate response to this situation.
Sort of get in this frame of mind that that's just the way it's supposed to be.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, once you've labeled, something as a security threat, or once you've labeled a person as a terrorist, you're absolutely primed for a certain type of response to that, and you're more willing to accept things that maybe you wouldn't accept outside of that context, where you're thinking my security is at risk, or our security as a country is at risk. Yeah.
So we as civilians, if you will, start sort of thinking that way. And I think, Abby, you had brought up a little bit about veterans coming back home. So we've talked about sort of the tangible tanks and camouflage and such, and then the surveillance. But also when, military intervention is done and a soldier comes back home and he or she goes back to their business or their attorneys or their teachers, they go on about their lives. But others find jobs in which they've taken these acquired skills and go into jobs and careers like defense contractors. How does that sort of, and I'm speaking specifically of like 3- and 4-star generals, of whom I know a few who are now defense contractors and getting paid pretty well. How does this contribute to the boomerang effect?
Well, one of the core insights of economics, so stepping back broadly, is this idea of human capital. Human capital, of course, refers to someone's skills, experiences, and so on, that allows them to be productive. And of course, one of the contexts within which economists talk about human capital is your wages. Of course, your human capital is what allows you to be productive, and your productivity is linked to your wages. And of course, this applies to all areas of life. Very rarely do you see it applied to these issues of the military and foreign intervention. But just think about it. If you dedicate your life to becoming a specialist in matters of military affairs, in social control, in thinking about how to control other people, where your wages, your higher productivity are going to be linked to? Doing that type of activity. And so if you look, this isn't a blanket claim for all people in the military. But if you look at many people in the military, especially as they move up the ranks, when they're done in the military, they tend to move into the private sector. And oftentimes they either start a private consulting firm or join one, or a lobbying firm that is involved in the defense industry. This is something, of course, that's referred to as the revolving door, the movement back and forth between private industry and the public industry. It affects a wide range of highly regulated industries, the banking industry, the healthcare industry, and the military sector. And so I live in Fairfax, Virginia, not too far outside Washington, D.C., in Alexandria, Virginia, which is in between Fairfax and D.C., there's tons of security firms. And so you'll see people who retire from the military, General Stanley McChrystal being one example. who of course headed for a while the operations in Afghanistan. They just go down to Alexandria and start McChrystal Consulting Group. And of course on their Rolodex, or the electronic version of a Rolodex, they have a range of contacts that they can easily just call up, get contracts, and use their kind of skills and mentality to earn a high wage, but also influence U.S. policy. And so this is just one channel through which experiences and skills with controlling people abroad come back home and influence domestic life. And if you look at these contractors, for instance, like L3 Communications is a top military contractor, they readily boast on their website that they employ veterans, and they're very proud of it. And that might be a very nice thing to do. But keep in mind the experience of those individuals and what it means for the type of work they're going to undertake and the way they're going to view the world.
So in taking all these these three little pillars that, as I see them, the tangible, the surveillance, and then the individuals, you start seeing a theme of consolidating control and power. Is that a bad thing, or is that just an efficient way to operate a country?
I mean, you could certainly envision a scenario where that consolidation is not necessarily a bad thing, but I'd like to bring it back to that paradox of government, that how do you watch the watchers, so to speak? So how do you get government to do the things that you want it to do and to prevent it from doing those things that you don't want it to do? So how do you prevent it from predating against its own citizens, from eroding civil liberties? One of the things that we discuss is that one of the earmarks of federalism is the fact that you have so many checks and balances that are put in place on the centralized government. So if you have your federal authority, your centralized state, but you have a lot of peripheral units who are operating at least somewhat independently, they can provide a check on that predatory behavior. So when you start to have that consolidation, one of the things that you're effectively doing is you're eroding the potential to have those checks on government power. And one of the things that we discuss, again, particularly as they relate to the war on drugs and the war on terror, is you have these events which draw these peripheral agencies toward this political center. So you're effectively, again, weakening those checks and balances that you have on the government.
So I skipped over our minute and a half each that you had for an introductory sort of setting the table, but I think we did really well on that. So as we sort of get into the final half hour or so of this, I'd like each of you to sort of give us 2.5 minutes, your thoughts around this whole issue of the book, Tyranny Comes Home, and then this whole notion of militarizing domestic law enforcement.
So one of the things that when we started this book, we had written several pieces before. So we'd written about police militarization. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on drones. So some of these were topics that were not unfamiliar to me. But as we started working through this project, and there were certainly other cases that we found which are not ultimately included in the book, but one of the things that I was surprised to find was how far back a lot of these things go. So mentioned earlier, and Chris has brought up as well, the U.S. occupation of the Philippines. And we found that that came up in 3 of the 4 case studies that wound up being included in the book. Now, if you're anything like me, my historical education, when the U.S. occupation of the Philippines was brought up, it was kind of included as like a footnote to the Spanish-American War, and then was left. So this was something I had no idea about. But you start to look at how the groundwork for things like police militarization, for things like the development of clean torture techniques or surveillance. You look at the groundwork that is being laid for these things, and you are seeing them sometimes being laid decades or maybe even a century or more in advance. And so one of the things that people often neglect are these non-monetary costs of war. we think about things like how much is it going to cost, and even then we know that the estimations that we have for conflict are not particularly great. There are things like civilian casualties, military casualties, things that we tend to think about. But I think for people who are concerned about civil liberties, and even people who are completely, in this case of the book, we focus on the United States, people who are just US-centric, I think have a really large incentive to pay attention to effects like this, because these are things that are potentially long and variable in terms of when they come back, but they are certainly potentially remarkably high cost.
I'll use my time to summarize what I think are the main implications, overlapping somewhat with what Abby just said, but in 4 kind of bullets, just to kind of summarize. Number 1, the costs of foreign intervention tend to be understated. As Abby said, that the focus, to the extent there is any focus at all, tends to be on monetary costs. To the extent that's even discussed, in the intervention in Syria last week, which of course goes back to President Obama's administration and even prior to that, there wasn't even discussion of that. But the costs tend to be understated because very rarely do people talk about expansions in the scope of state power or the potential for that. Surely government actors don't discuss that, but even pundits and so on rarely discuss that. Number 2, the consequences of foreign intervention are long and variable, as Abby stated. And so think about, for instance, the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act was passed in 1917 during the First World War, and the idea was to try to prevent people from undermining the U.S. government's effort. And of course, you can debate whether that was a good act or not. For the point I want to make, it's irrelevant. That act sat on the books, that law, for decades, until President Obama decided to use it against leakers. And of course, President Obama, the Obama administration, holds the record for the use of the Espionage Act. There was no way in 1917, when that act was designed and passed, that the people that did it could have anticipated it being used decades later. Again, the consequences are long and variable, so be very careful what you wish for and understand the nature of foreign intervention, which is you are literally giving a loaded gun to government in the name of protecting you. And that's something that's important. The standard response to that is, don't worry, constitutional constraints. We have the Constitution, we have courts. Another theme of the book is that formal constitutional constraints, when it comes to matters of national security and foreign affairs, are at best speed bumps. They are what people refer to as parchment barriers. That is, they're easy to get around. Courts tend to be very passive when it comes to matters of national security. Much of it takes place secretly, and so people don't even know about it. For instance, those in Congress who are responsible for congressional oversight don't even know about it or know very little, and so on. That leads to the final implication, which, as I mentioned earlier, is citizen ideology. That is really, to our way of thinking, the only key or legitimate solution to this, which is that citizens have to value certain things highly enough. They have to value individual freedom over what are oftentimes empty promises by those in political office. They have to understand the contest between domestic government and liberty and freedom. And they also have to understand the way that government operates. And so kind of, and this, again, isn't new to us. There's a famous philosopher, David Hume, a Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, and he has something called what he referred to as political maxim, which is when we're talking about political rules, imagine that the knave is in charge. And that's a good rule of thumb. When it comes to politics in general, many people say, well, if my person is in charge, my political party's in charge, that's good. But when my political party is no longer in charge, that's terrible. So when we're thinking about these kind of issues, one way to think about it is to kind of apply the precautionary principle to it. To think to yourself, let me think about, whether it's an actual person or a hypothetical, my most despised political leader. And what would it mean for that political leader to control the levers of power, whether it's now or 10 years in the future? And would I want that person to have this power? If you're skeptical of that, or if the answer is no, then to our way of thinking, that's a very good reason to be against the expansion in power. And that way of thinking, it doesn't provide an easy solution. It doesn't provide a solution to all problems, but it's a way to check yourself and to think through kind of what's at stake here as we think through the complexities of these issues.
Great. Dr. Eckert.
Excellent. And I think my points are going to somewhat piggyback off of Chris and Abigail's, but just this really what came through to me as I was reading the book is kind of the necessity of citizen vigilance and kind of the willingness to pay the cost of citizenship in terms of, being engaged, paying attention to what's happening, perhaps thinking through some of these long-term consequences of things that we see happening. And, when I look at some of the dynamics in our political system today, I don't necessarily see a lot of people who are willing to engage with the political system in that way. We specifically see a lack of attention to foreign policy, right? I mean, surveys tell us every election that people don't tend to vote on the basis of foreign policy issues. It's something that I think on some level we feel that we can afford to neglect or overlook, that we don't necessarily have to pay attention to what's going on abroad, because again we're kind of envisioning this very sharp divide that whatever we're doing globally is not necessarily going to come back to haunt us in a very direct way, and so we tend to see this acceptance of the types of behaviors and the types of strategies that the book digs into in terms of constraining individual freedom, in terms of suppressing liberty, and in terms of social control. And there tends to be an acceptance, or at least an indifference to that. So to kind of revisit the Mark Twain quote at the very beginning, I think that what he's really talking about that we don't see happening is a concept of reciprocity. And on some level, what that means is that we're willing to accept a very significant, very high level of social control as long as we're doing it to someone else. And we're not necessarily making the connection that those same types of practices are going to be implemented and utilized domestically against us. But on some level, I mean, I think we've all been making the point that a lot of these practices that are troublesome to us are things that do endure and continue across different administrations with leaders of different parties. So in the end, I mean, I think that the solution has to be a level of political engagement beyond just voting, because if we're replacing one leader is doing things that are problematic, like the Obama administration. And I'll admit I voted for Obama twice. I liked Obama, but it doesn't mean necessarily that I liked all the practices that he was engaging in terms of surveillance and use of drones and things like that. At the same time, if we think about the most recent election, it's not clear to me that we had an alternative where there was a candidate whose foreign policy or domestic policy, for that matter, would be less militaristic or less given to social control. So, the solution, I think, has to at least involve a level of engagement beyond just voting and selecting from, between various militaristic options. It has to involve a level of engagement, a form of engagement that holds government accountable in a way beyond just changing leadership. Yeah.
Great. And that's a great segue into at least my question. I want to make sure that the students, everybody has a good time ample time to ask some questions. So as I ask my question or sort of make a statement, I want you to think about some interesting questions while we have these experts right here in our own backyard. And I don't know if this is so much a question as it is maybe a statement, just stunning how much. So I read the book and then I go, as a journalist, I follow the money, right? It's like, okay, what's the other motivation here? And of course, you all know that in 1991, the Pentagon came up with an equipment program, essentially, that sourced out $5 billion so that domestic law enforcement could be able to purchase these pieces of equipment if they wanted to, or they can apply for federal grants. And so I learned that there's this resistance amongst lawmakers, shockingly, to change the game, if you will, because a lot of the money, there's about I don't know, tens of thousands of dollars of campaign contributions from defense contractors. So you start seeing this web where everything's really connected, so that the incentive to stop sort of doing this is not really in the hands of government, as you pointed out, Dr. Eckert. It's really up to us as the citizenry. So with that, I'd like to open it up for some questions and some statements and some really good dialogue. Yes.
Sure. Well, that's a great question. And so the way I understood the question is, well, how do we go about changing this? It's ingrained in our mentality, this kind of militarism. Oftentimes there's pushback if you try to raise any kind of skepticism about it. And so it's a hard issue. In some sense, our goal in the project and talking about it in settings like this is to at least raise awareness to get people thinking about an alternative, which oftentimes they're not exposed to. But the other thing we talk about in the book, and I wish more people talked about it, is this idea, and it's a very cheap way for people, it's like a stopping argument. If you ever try to raise anything against U.S. foreign policy or the use of the military, they'll say, well, you're unpatriotic. You in the extreme, they say things like, you hate America, or you hate the soldiers. Nothing could be further from the truth. One of the passages we have in the book talks about, at the end, when we talk about what we call the anti-militarist ideology or way of thinking about the world, is the exact opposite. In order to be a good patriot, a good citizen, you should always and everywhere be skeptical of your government, irrespective of who is in power. That does not mean that you are anti-American. It means you care about America so deeply that you are unwilling to simply assume that people that have a massive amount of power over your life are going to do what they say they're going to do, given the incentives inherent in government, some of which were just brought up in terms of what many people refer to as the military-industrial complex, or the military-industrial congressional complex is a more appropriate way to put it. And so constantly questioning these things, just for your own as a citizen, but then, as Amy was talking about, in terms of broader citizen engagement is an important step forward. And so just being aware, I think, is a good first step for a lot of people. And I'm not saying that's a panacea unto itself, but I think that's an important first step. Beyond that, I think getting involved, to the extent you want to get involved in various political activities, is an important way to do this as well. Not simply voting, as was pointed out, and I completely agree with, but in other areas as well, and thinking about it. The two main political parties are basically identical on this, on issues of foreign policy. And you see this during the debates. One will say, we live in an unsafe world, even though that's not empirically true. We live in America, we are the safest any country has ever been in the history of humankind. But again, that's the fear-mongering. But you hear that from both sides, and people are scared to deviate from that because they don't want to be soft on security. And so citizen awareness is the first step, and that's what I would urge you all to think about. Irrespective of what political party or affiliation you have or where you come down on these issues, just think about it. And that's a good first step, but not the only step.
Another question. There's got to be burning questions. Yes.
Nope. Oh, there it is, yeah. So you speak to political engagement, and you guys speak to kind of action. One of the things that keeps coming into my mind is the idea that a lot of these things are policy. A lot of them are about internal policies that are determined either by the police or determined by politics. We get a vote on who we put in, but like you said, during debates and during deciding who our political representatives are, they're either very much similar or they happily avoid the topic because they just don't even want to dive into it. So what action can a citizen actually take in order to curb the policies? What can be taken? Should we now redecide how we look at voting and what things are used in voting? Should we be voting on foreign policy issues as opposed to letting our representatives do it? Should we be voting more on what our police do as opposed to allowing policies and further up the chain decide?
As a political scientist, I guess I can take that one. Thanks for the question. I think it's a really important question. Looking at is the answer to kind of reconfigure what democracy means and go to perhaps a more direct form of democracy, or is there something else? I don't know. I don't know that we necessarily would need to kind of replace the representative democracy that we have with a more direct form of democracy where decisions are necessarily, where every decision is put to everyone. And what I would suggest is a couple of things. One is that even in the system as it is, we certainly have a lot more avenues for engagement beyond just the voting booth. Voting is obviously a very important act, but there are other forms of kind of reaching out and making your policy preferences known, whether it's contacting your elected representatives or whether it's participating in some form of activism. There are a lot of other avenues by which we can kind of engage with the process beyond the act of pulling a lever once every 4 years or every 2 years in the case of congressional elections. I also would like to kind of come back to a point that Tamara had raised, which is the influence of money in our political system. And I honestly believe, this is my honest personal belief, that we won't see significant changes in our political system unless the role of money and the role of campaign contributions is limited. I think that's a huge component of especially this dynamic. When you have, the people who are profiting from the sale of this military equipment to local police jurisdictions, or who are profiting from various aspects of our foreign policy, not only is there no incentive to kind of change the course, right? There's only the incentive to kind of continue expanding both our military intervention abroad as well as militarization of the police domestically, and several of the other dynamics that the authors touch on in this book. I think that so much of that comes down to the influence of money in our political system, and I think until we constrain that, and until we begin to kind of rethink the significance of kind of letting corporations kind of run free in terms of their campaign contributions. I really don't think we're going to see kind of greater accountability on the part of elected representatives to their constituents.
And on that note, just to dovetail on that, Dr. Eckert, it seems like to me that there are more and more protest rallies, social justice groups arising now than I've ever seen it in my lifetime. And maybe what people are feeling is that they're mad as hell, not going to take it anymore kind of attitude. And so you start seeing where people are taking that citizenry responsibility very seriously. Maybe it's time to deconstruct some of our structures. Questions?
This is a hard question, but a good question. So thank you for raising it. I don't think and again, I don't know this with certainty, I don't think simply ending the partnership would necessarily change that. Because, of course, the dilemma that you run into is that government has a monopoly on the provision of military equipment and military activities, or what falls under the purview of national defense, or what is oftentimes national offense. They need to get the resources to do that from somewhere. In a capitalist economy, because there is private ownership over the means of production, they have to extract those resources from the private sector. That's either in partnerships or it's through extraction, through taking it, buying it through taxation or whatever, debt, issuance. No matter what, you're going to have an interplay between private and public actors. And so, and it's interesting because the kind of outcome of that is a outcome that leads to something that mimics a fascist economic system. A fascist economic system in Italy, for instance, was and what differentiated from socialism was under socialism you had a nationalization of the means of production. Under fascism you had these public-private partnerships where the state, the nation, was the end-all be-all, and the government had to work with private actors to achieve the ends, to elevate the state, even at the expense of individual citizens. Interestingly, many people, often on the right, but not always politically, who are strong advocates, or at least they purport to be strong advocates for capitalism, for markets, for individual rights, when it comes to matters of military affairs, are for very strong enlargements in the military, even though it has these effects you're talking about. The only way out of this, to my way of thinking, is to severely shrink government involvement in general. And the only way to do that is to shrink the size of the military. Military spending as a percentage of GDP is actually relatively small compared to like World War II, for instance. Still a enormous amount in absolute terms. The US government dwarfs other countries, including China and Russia, which many policymakers like to point out as the greatest threats ever to the United States. The US government dwarfs those countries in terms of military spending, just in absolute terms. And so just pulling that back, if you cut the US military spending in half, it would still dominate both Russia and China combined. And you could keep pushing it smaller and smaller. That's hard to do, but that's what you would need to do. And so, again, the way I think about this is how do you go about doing that? Again, it comes down on citizens and the mindset that you and I have as citizens. And this isn't meant to be some romantic ideal about democracy, or that if one person just all of a sudden changed their mindset, it's magically going to change. But you all need to think about what you believe the appropriate relationship between citizen and the state is, and always keep this in mind. The wonderful part about a free society is that government is intended to serve us as citizens. That is, government operates at the consent of citizens, not the other way around. Under authoritarian regimes, the way those are structured is people act as if the authoritarian government acts on behalf of the citizens, so it reverses the relationship. But again, when it comes to matters of national security, people tend to flip that relationship over. They act as if the government is doing you and I a favor by protecting us, and we should somehow be thankful for that, and we should be very willing to turn over liberties to them in the name of more security. But the trade-off is not that simple, because there's another dimension to this, which is that we give up liberty in the name of security, but we also make ourselves less secure from domestic government. And so thinking about that and coming to some kind of conclusion on your own, as I mentioned earlier, is the best we can do. And as more and more people hopefully think about those things, the optimistic view is that there's some kind of consensus. It doesn't have to be everyone, but a large enough kind of consensus where we get a tipping point. And keep in mind that in American history, there have been ebbs and flows. The origins of America's always intervened. The government's always intervened, whether it's westward expansion, whether it's the Civil War. There's always been wars and conflict. And so I'm not trying to pretend that there was one point where government didn't engage in conflict. But there was a strong anti-militaristic streak in early America, where there was strong skepticism about concentrated power. And to my way of thinking, there's no reason we can't go back there. This isn't some kind of monocausal explanation that there's only one direction forward and we're kind of stuck. It's reversible, but it's difficult to do.
It's interesting how fear and the promise of security is one of the strongest weapons we have, right? Yes, sir.
talked about the idea of bringing it back and reversing it, and we've seen in recent past that if we're trying to attempt to reverse certain engagements that we've gotten into in the world, that we're having a lot of negative consequences coming back from it, power vacuums that are being left open, allowing any warlord or any powerful militia that exists in the area to be able to take over government control, and then in turn creating new and exciting problems. So what would you say is to solve these kind of problems? Say we back out our military from the Middle East or Southeast Asia or areas where it seems to be that we're only causing more damage. How do we disengage without causing more problems?
I don't know that there's necessarily a clean answer to that. I mean, the obvious solution is to just knock it off in the first place and then not get yourself into these issues. There is something economics studying the dynamics of intervention. And so whether we're talking about intervening in a foreign country, or if we're talking about the war on drugs, or we're talking about any kind of intervention into society, government has really two options when that intervention does not go as planned or fails. They can abandon that particular policy, or, and this is the one that typically happens, they double down. And so it's oh no, we didn't have enough people, we didn't have enough resources, we didn't have enough planning. In terms of how do you get out of these things without causing damage, I don't know that there is a clean answer to that question. You see very quickly, looking at any kind of international conflict especially, it gets remarkably complicated very, very quickly. In Chris's earlier book, Doing Bad by Doing Good, he talks about a lot of these cases where people go into, say, Afghanistan, and they don't have relevant cultural knowledge, which would be remarkably important. I think another thing that's interesting to consider, so in the event that, we left Iraq or Afghanistan in, half the time than we did, pretending like we're not there anymore. What does that regime look like? Is that preferred to what's happened afterwards? And those are tough questions to answer because you don't have a historical counterfactual. We simply don't know.
I think I want to give an alternative way of thinking about it, which is to kind of shift the language you used. And so there's the standard way of posing these questions is, what should we do? What if we left? The we is the U.S. government. It's not you and I, unless you were there, in which case you are part of the we, but I'm assuming you're not. But a lot you hear two kind of arguments, which is there's more than two, but the main kind of language you hear with this, if we don't do it, there'll be problems in the world, meaning the U.S. government, or someone else will do it. Russia and China will expand, and so on. But so what? These are cheap kind of arguments, I think, and they don't really work, because you can use that logic to justify any intervention everywhere. We live in an imperfect world. We live in a world where there are lots of bad regimes doing terrible things to people. We also live in a world of scarcity. We also live in a world where there are limited resources, where there is limited knowledge, and we have to make tough decisions, us as citizens and the U.S. government. And so how do you pick? You can intervene anywhere in the world to address concerns. And so to my way of thinking, there's no, when people talk in those terms, there's no way of selecting those kind of things. Like which one to go into. There's no decision-making criteria to separate the good interventions from the bad ones. But I also think there's low-hanging fruit. There's low-hanging fruit if, again, people are truly committed to helping people that are suffering in the world. Two of them, and I think these are among the most troubling concerns of the current administration, are immigration policy, and trade policy. Only politicians turn trade, which is a fundamentally peaceful interaction between two human beings who happen to be born in international trade in two geographic locations with arbitrary borders set up, into a tool of warfare. You never hear private individuals talking about a trade war. You never hear private people saying, oh, what are you up to? I'm in a trade war with my grocer. I have a trade deficit with them, so I have to impose some kind of trade restrictions. Because that's patently absurd. It doesn't make sense. But you introduce magical fake lines into the discussion, all of a sudden it's China versus the U.S., Mexico versus the U.S. Those are the tools of government. That is turning a fundamentally peaceful interaction that brings people together into a conflict. This is something that's rarely discussed. Immigration, free movement of individuals is a way of alleviating human suffering and again of bringing people together. So when you hear politicians talk about it, they typically focus on the costs, the negatives, potential costs and negatives, I should say, typically in the name of fear-mongering. But these are policies that we can look at that don't involve using force, don't involve intervening in other people's lives, but I would contend are very high value added in terms of improving both the human well-being of people that are suffering and of bringing about global peace or contributing to that end.
Absolutely, and really address some social issues within our reach. Other questions? But I saw some hands going up, fake hands. Tim.
In that area.
So we can talk about that in a couple of ways. Certainly, when we talk about their surveillance apparatus, that is not something that is, geographically constrained to just the cities. I think maybe a really good illustration of that is looking at the expansion of SWAT teams. So the first SWAT team was created in Los Angeles in the mid-1960s. It's an interesting case. So you have a former Marine by the name of John Nelson who returns from Vietnam. He's trained in a very special unit which is intended for reconnaissance but is actually a highly aggressive killing force. He sees the potential structure of this unit as a way to better control crowds at race riots. You see very quickly, particularly when you start the war on drugs, this rapid expansion of SWAT teams. And not just in cities which have, populations of 750,000 people. So now I think you have something like 95% of populations, or towns with populations of 50,000 or more people have a SWAT team, or what's called a police paramilitary unit, or PPU. And so in terms of what we look at, certainly you have rural areas that are absolutely covered in addition to urban areas. Something else that's interesting with respect to that is related to the use of drones. So something that a lot of people are not aware of is that the jurisdiction of Customs and Border Patrol extends 100 miles into the United States. So if you're somebody like me who lives in Florida, your entire state is encompassed by that rule. A variety of other major cities, towns, and everything in between. So I assume that they're surveilling the orange fields and the alligators and the Everglades as much as they're looking at people in Tampa. I don't know.
That's interesting. Dr. Eckert, I want to bring you into this, a question that arose in my head. You mentioned earlier, I believe, that the U.S. is sort of unique in this militarization of domestic law enforcement. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, why are we so dialed into this?
That's a great question, and perhaps Chris and Abigail might actually know a little bit more about this than I do. But I off the top of my head, I think there are a few things that are significant in our political system that contribute to it. One of those being, to come back to the influence of kind of defense contractors and contractors who are selling this equipment and their political interests. I think that's a significant piece of it. I think also our waging of two largely internal wars, and I use the term war loosely, being the war on drugs and the war on terror, again have kind of primed us to see the military response from the police as being an appropriate response to what we might alternatively view as kind of ordinary criminal activity. I mean, we don't necessarily need to make the leap to viewing activity associated with either of these two activities as being a security threat. I mean, we could approach it through a law enforcement paradigm, and rely on police work and court systems and kind of our ordinary criminal justice process to deal with it. But I think that once we begin kind of framing it in the rhetoric of war, it leads us to expect a certain type of response, or to be accepting of a certain type of response that includes the type of militarization that we're seeing. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
Oh, there we go. All right. Kind of following up on your point there, and something you mentioned earlier as well, is that it's harder and harder to tell these days who, is a drug dealer, or who are the criminals, I guess, that we're looking for. And I guess my question would be, what role, if any, do you believe that it's not just the escalation of an arms race between, say, drug dealers and police, but also even private citizens with, say, modified military weapons that are sold for consumer use, AR-15s, whatever the case might be, and what role do you believe that has played in sort of the escalation and militarization of police, if any?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, certainly that's something else that we're seeing in terms of increased access to weapons that, at least in my view, civilians don't really have a need for as such, right? I mean, we can imagine people fulfilling kind of their legitimate needs or interests or whatever with weapons that are significantly less lethal than what we have access to in this country. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a significant dimension of this. In international relations, we have a dynamic that we refer to as the security dilemma. And what the security dilemma describes is it describes a dynamic where one state's efforts to secure itself, to defend itself, end up making everyone more insecure, right? Because of course, if the state is, building up its weapons, it's enhancing its defenses, its neighbors are going to kind of observe what it's doing and worry that what it's actually planning is not defense, but of course offense. And so it kind of fuels this competitive dynamic, this arms race, if you will. And yeah, I mean, there are times when I kind of look at what's happening domestically with the police, but not only with the police, also, as you mentioned, private citizens. And I wonder to what extent we're really beginning to kind of mimic that dynamic in the international system domestically, where, if I know that my neighbor has a lot of guns, it's going to kind of make me feel insecure, make me feel wary, and perhaps motivate me to kind of enter into kind of my own individual arms race with the neighbor. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a dynamic that absolutely has the potential to contribute to kind of the pervasiveness of significant weaponry in our society. And kind of again, in a parallel to the international system, it's rare for people or states to have weaponry at that type of level and not eventually use it in some way.
I think this is an important point. One thing I just want to suggest to build off this is kind of a thought experiment that goes beyond just this, and I'll give another example in a moment, is just to urge a symmetry of assumptions. And so a lot of times you'll hear people say things like, especially policymakers, they'll say things like citizens shouldn't have X, but government should in order to protect citizens.
But of course, where do the people that are going to wield that power come from? They come from the citizenry. And so you have to ask yourself, if private citizens shouldn't have certain things, why should those same citizens have them when they are in government? Given the history we have of the U.S. governments, and governments throughout history, I would say, both abusing their power and ignoring constraints on that power, it's unclear why we would want that. So what are some examples? Weapons, as was just discussed. So one thing to think about, maybe private citizens shouldn't have them, but why not then ban government from having them as well? If we're going to ban one, it seems like we'd want to ban all people from using them, given how unsafe they make people. Here's another example. Just a couple weeks ago, there was testimony in front of Congress about privacy and Facebook and social media. And of course, a lot of people are clamoring, mainly in government, for government to control the surveillance by private firms. How these folks aren't dismissed and laughed at, I don't know. Because why should they have the power, government, I mean, to surveil us? Again, the most powerful surveillance apparatus in the history of mankind. Magnitudes more than anything that Facebook can do, by the way. And yet they think they should be able to regulate surveillance by, or what they call surveillance, the collection of information by private firms. So again, let's think about this. If we're going to ban certain companies from collecting information, I say let's carry it all the way through. Let's ban government from doing it too. Let's shut down the surveillance apparatus. That sounds radical to many people, but if you actually study the surveillance apparatus, it has a lot of costs. For instance, you collect so much information that those in the U.S. government are unable to sort through it. You end up kind of in a needle in a haystack type situation, which is why I really liked Amy's point about good old-fashioned police work. A lot of issues, a lot of threats can just be solved through good old-fashioned police work. Local police officers working together with detectives and kind of using traditional methods to overcome these things. And so the idea that simply collecting more information is making us safer is one of the great myths that I think people need to rethink.
It kind of comes after that. The government needs to do something, and so, opens up a Pandora's box, which isn't always great. More questions? Yes, and then. Oh. Should have worn your tennis shoes, Dr. Padilla.
Yeah, you were talking earlier about weapons and military and everything else. With all the shootings that have been going on at schools, universities throughout the nation, I want to know your opinion on if instructors should carry weapons to limit the loss of lives. Just your opinion on it.
So slightly different topic, but maybe in terms of militarizing teachers, sort of that theme of, where do we stop in arming citizens to protect
like a
whomever?
self-defense to limit the lives that are lost. Just wondering.
So in terms of the, should teachers or ought teachers be allowed, to carry weapons in their classroom, and whether or not that would make a difference. I'm not sure. I mean, ultimately, that's an empirical question. But one thing, just to put things in perspective, so I know a few times we've talked about this idea of, the threat, whatever that threat happens to be, of being very large. And actually, if you look at that statistically, you find out that it's really not that scary. So I tell my students, for instance, that you're more likely to die from a brain-eating parasite than you are to be killed in a terror attack. You're also more likely to die from things like the flu, or falling out of bed, or drowning in the bathtub. There's a long list. And so one thing to keep in mind, I think, in terms of school shootings, is that still statistically, even with what seems to be this spike, if you actually look historically at the trends, there are fewer school shootings now than there were in, say, 1990, and that statistically it's still a remarkably rare event. And so that would be, I think, and to maybe bring it back or to connect it to what it is that we're talking about. Questions regarding that policy and regarding the policies that we talk about. There's a question about, at what cost do we potentially implement further policies? So will those policies maybe make people feel safer, whether it's, teachers carrying weapons, or if it's more resource officers, if it's metal detectors, whatever that happens to be. It might make people feel better, but is it actually effective, and at what particular cost? And I think that it's a complicated question.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I mean, since the Columbine shooting that happened, of course, locally now almost 20 years ago, we've seen an expansion in terms of the presence of police in schools, in terms of school resource officers. And we haven't seen an instance where a police officer in a school has been able to effectively respond to a school shooting. So I think it's somewhat naive to think that teachers who have no weapons training or no special expertise in the use of these weapons are going to be very effective in terms of stopping a school shooting. On a personal level, I have no interest in carrying a weapon. That's not why I went to grad school.
Good question. Right here.
No, it's a great question. Mm-hmm. And we've certainly seen challenges, right, to the legitimacy of the election process and the voting process in a number of ways, whether it's it's foreign intervention of various types, or whether it's people who aren't eligible to vote alleged to be voting. And on some level, I mean, again, these are kind of also empirical questions. Were there people who weren't eligible to vote who voted? Did, in fact, Russian hacking of the DNC or various types of interferences, in fact, influence people? From my perspective, I'm concerned about some of these challenges to the legitimacy of election results, and I think it's interesting that in this past election we had the candidate who won and who prevailed challenging the legitimacy of the results. And perhaps this is kind of my worst case scenario thinking about 2020, but my concern is a little less about those challenges to the 2016 election, and more concerned with kind of what happens if we see a similar challenge or a similar attempt to question the legitimacy of the results in 2020. I mean, that's kind of the scenario that personally, at least, is very troubling to me.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Alexander Norgard, Aerospace Studies. I know this was asked before, but I want to follow up on steps that we can take to combat this. The reason I ask that is because this is kind of being spoken about in like a cause and effect boomerang type situation where these things are happening, but is there a possibility that this is sort of economically agenda driven? I know in aerospace, the safer I can make you feel, the more things I can sell you. Talk about citizen mobilization and coming together, but like the CIA controls Facebook, they control Amazon, they know what I'm talking about, they know what I'm thinking. If the possibility that this is agenda driven and it's inherent in our government towards people that we can't vote in and out. You talked about the revolving door, people coming in and out of the military into out of positions in power. If those are the people kind of extending the corrosion of our civil liberties, what groups can we join or what actions can we take in our daily lives that prevent these types of situations from spiraling out of control? Like, who do we talk to? What can we form together? Because it doesn't seem like, you know, we get one step forward and two steps back with the current situation right now, and I'm not really sure what we can do as an average civilian versus someone in a position of power.
Mm-hmm. Good question. Go ahead.
So one of the things that we talk about in the book is that our explanation for this expansion in the scale and scope of government, we certainly don't intend for it to be monocausal. So we recognize that there are multiple margins and multiple avenues through which government expands, and we talk about them. An economist named Tyler Coyne, for example, talks about the expansion of government partially being a function of improved technology. If you look at other models for how government grows, a lot of times they're categorized into one of two broader literatures. So what are called citizen over state theories. So citizens in search of additional benefits or safety, whatever it may be, push in order to expand government. On the kind of opposite side of that, although they're certainly not mutually exclusive, you have state over citizen theories. So you have, through bureaucratic channels, this continuous incentive to expand the scale and scope of government. In terms of what else to do, I really think, and I recognize that for us to say that citizen ideology is really important may sound unsatisfying, because we like to have these kinds of concrete steps that we feel like that we can take. And I don't know that this is necessarily one of those cases where there is a linear prescriptive path for us to go down to say, if we want to roll this back, this is the first step and this is the second step. But I do think, and this is something that in the very first time that we addressed police militarization, a natural question that we received was, well, how do we roll this back? And people are talking about things like you brought up. So you have a lot of different agencies that are involved in all different aspects of our lives. There are financial incentives involved. There are a lot of different moving pieces. And so where do you start? How do you work that back? So you're bringing up things like, the military-industrial complex. Okay, that gets really rough really quickly. Well, what precedes that? And so ultimately, at the end of the day, the reason that those things are able to function, and I think Chris mentioned this earlier, is because it ultimately, when you get down to it, there's the consent of the people who are being governed. Politicians, government agents, they do respond to incentives. If they don't respond to incentives, they don't wind up having jobs. And so if you have people who truly do care about these particular issues, your political actors start to care. And when you have people who may be able to actually make adjustments to those constraints or to those rules of the game, that you might start to see some additional movement. And so I don't think that there's a prescriptive plan to be put in place here, but I will just reiterate that thinking about these issues and encouraging other people to think about these issues, again, irrespective of their political affiliation, left, right, or center, to think about these issues concretely. And I think, again, Chris brought up earlier David Hume, and thinking about, in the event that the person you hate the most is in charge, what kind of power do you want them to have? Knowing that even if the person that you like is in power right now, that person will not be there, and the person that you hate the most will probably be there tomorrow.
I think we have time for one last question. Yes, sir.
So you guys mentioned like the war on drugs and everything. So my question was like how do you guys feel like it failed, or like what do you think the solutions are, or how should the war on drugs like be treated? Should they just be decriminalized? Like how should that be like processed,
The war on drugs, to be very blunt about it, I'm not that clever to intend that, but in any case, it is a dismal failure, not by my judgment, but by the judgment of the people that perpetuated the war, or have perpetuated it, which is on all margins, drug use, drug availability, and so on down the line, has done nothing that the proponents of the war on drugs themselves said was going to happen, happened. And you see various manifestations of that domestically. Another manifestation, go look in Afghanistan. The U.S. government has spent billions of dollars battling opium production, and it's at an all-time high. Again, high. I'm on a roll here. In any case, the undoing the war on drugs is a hard thing for many of the points that have already been raised, mainly vested interests. But you all here have done a great job relative to a lot of the rest of the country. Decriminalizing drugs, all drugs, I would suggest, and I realize that's a controversial issue, but I would go full on. That doesn't mean you don't have treatment for people that are suffering. It doesn't mean that it's the same as saying, look, assuming you agree, I think alcohol should be legal. That's not endorsing alcoholism. That is endorsing the fact that you recognize that the costs of prohibiting something are so costly that it is not worth the purported benefits. And I think it's the same with the war on drugs. And I think people are slowly starting to get there. I think with medical marijuana, it started. The opioid epidemic across the country, which is largely, not entirely, largely the result of the war on drugs. It will further push this kind of decriminalization forward, hopefully. But it's a terrible thing. It ruins the lives of innocent people. It prevents them from being productive and contributing citizens, of getting an education, of getting a productive job, of being with their families because they're tied up in the legal system and in jail. I mean, this is just a terrible thing. And so the faster we can unravel that, the better. And I think it will have dramatic effects for human well-being, both domestically and internationally, because, of course, the other thing is, to the extent the war on drugs is effective domestically, it simply exports violence to other countries. And so you start looking in Mexico, for instance, and to the extent the U.S. government has been effective in squashing violence here, it's just pushed itself and led to widespread violence and devastation in other countries. And so to my way of thinking, the quicker that can be undone and in its most radical form and as quickly as possible would be a welcome change in policy.
There are some policies where people will ask you things like, in the event that you could change one policy, what would that policy be? And my answer, unequivocally, every single time, is if the button was in front of me right now and I could end the war on drugs, particularly as Chris says, by legalizing everything, so from soup to nuts, so pot to meth, don't care, would hit that button in a second every single time.
Dr. Eckert?
Yeah. I would agree with what's been said so far in response to this question. I mean, in some ways, this is kind of the classic scenario where we look at, the problems that drugs actually can cause in terms of crime, in terms of addiction, and kind of feel this impulse that we have to do something, right? But it's not clear to me that the something has to be the type of policy responses that we've seen associated with the war on drugs, right? As our previous respondents have touched on, decriminalizing, takes a lot of the incentive for the criminal activity that we're concerned with out of the equation, and not to discount the very real issues that people with problems with drug addiction face. But if we look at this in a comparative perspective, there are other places where it's treated not as a criminal problem but as a public health problem. And I think there's a case to be made that this is an approach that secures us the benefit that we want in terms of helping people who have a problem without necessarily entailing the very real costs that we've seen associated with the war on drugs.
That's a great note to end on. I've got at least 3 takeaways. I don't know about you. This was an amazing panel. Number 1, citizen ideology is a thing. It works. Get engaged. Number 2, the government serves us, so keep that in mind. And then number 3, read the book. It's amazing. You're going to love it. It's so interesting, and it starts connecting the dots that we kind of know some pieces here and there, but When you read this, I think it really pulls it all together. Can we give all of our panelists a big round of applause? Abigail R. Hall, Christopher Coyne, and Amy Eckert. Thank you all for being here this afternoon.